would be your own understanding of, or more like the general understanding of monotheism? Would that then particularly be of the fundamental God of like, how do you actually make the distinction that it has, the God of Israel has like this fluidity of selfhood, but at the same time, it's also monotheism. But what's then your understanding of monotheism in that context?
Yeah, great question. Because initially what one might think, well, the fluidity idea shows up in Babylonia and Assyria and Canaan. It must be it's a polytheistic idea. It's a whole different way of conceiving of divinity. And monotheism is different. In monotheism, there's one God who has one self. But when you look more closely, I think that turns out not to be the case for a few reasons. First of all, archaic and classical Greek texts, Homer, Hesiod, even much later Greek texts from the time of the tragedians and even later than that, when they're talking about the gods, they're clearly polytheistic. They believe in many gods, but they never talk about this fluidity idea. These are polytheistic texts for whom the gods are more similar to human beings. They don't have fluid cells that can split into different parts while retaining a certain unity, and they don't overlap with each other the way they do over in the ancient Near East. So polytheism, it can have the fluidity point of view, or it can have the non-fluidity point of view when it's talking about the deities. If polytheism can have a fluidity theology or a non-fluidity theology, that suggests the possibility that, well, maybe monotheism might be able to have a monotheistic fluidity theology or a non-monotheistic fluidity, or a monotheistic non-fluidity theology. And that's, I think, what's happening in the Bible. The texts like the JE texts or parts of Psalms or parts of Isaiah that do display what I'm calling the fluidity model, they don't believe that other gods or goddesses are real powers in the universe. They don't believe that it's legitimate for Israelites to pray to other gods and goddesses. They believe that Israelites should pray only to the one God. They believe that that this one God is the only creator of the universe, but they also believe that God, probably in God's graciousness, God allows God's self to manifest itself in the world in a smaller, more user-friendly, easier to confront format. And so God can manifest God's self in the world, not in God's full self, which would be frightening, overpowering, even deadly, but in some very small scale way. That's what happens, for example, to Moses at the burning bush. That's what happens to Abraham when the three visitors come to Abraham. These human characters are meeting God in those passages, but meeting God in a much, much smaller, user-friendly fashion. They're not meeting other gods. They're not meeting multiple gods. So these are not polytheistic texts. These are still monotheistic texts, but they're monotheistic texts that are saying God can make God's self available to humanity in a smaller scale format that's easier to handle. In other words, in biblical Hebrew, the word malach really has two different meanings. The primary meaning is messenger. So God, when God sends an angel in the sense of a messenger, which is the more frequent use of the term, that's some being who's different from God, whom God is sending on a mission. That being might be a heavenly being. There are cases where that the term is applied to human beings, but that's somebody who's different from God. And that's what we usually think of an angel as being, some heavenly creature with wings that flutters down here and does something on God's behalf. But there are some cases in the Bible where the malach is clearly very closely related to God, is not a being separate from God on a mission for God, but is a small scale manifestation of God on the planet Earth. And so in Exodus 23, when God says, okay, I'm not going to go with you through the Sinai wilderness because that would be too much, but I will allow my manifestation to go with you, and my name is in that manifestation. So that manifestation is God, but it isn't all of God. It's a smaller scale descent of God into the universe, but it doesn't encompass all of God. And so in that case, I'd say that the Hebrew word malach would better be translated as avatar rather than angel in the sense that we usually think of angel. It's not a being who's a messenger. It's actually a being who is part of God, but is just not all of God.
Actually, what were the first Jewish exegetes talking about when they came across those type of verses?
So Jewish interpreters of the Bible, in the post-biblical period, I think some of them, the truth is, some of them have no problem with that anthropomorphism. It's interesting. We nowadays think of anthropomorphic portrayals of God as being a problem. They've got to be sort of explained away. But in the ancient world, the rabbis, for example, and other ancient Jewish interpreters, I don't think that they had that same problem with anthropomorphic references to God. It was really more in the Middle Ages, as Jews became more and more familiar with Greek philosophy, especially Jews who lived in the Arab world and were able to read the works of Arabic Muslim philosophers, and also the works of Greek philosophers that have been translated to Arabic. It's only then that we really see, with maybe with one ancient exception,
Right.
that we really see Jewish philosophers unhappy about anthropomorphism. So it's with, let's say, Saadia Gaon, with Maimonides in the 10th, the 12th century, that we see attempts to say, well, this looks anthropomorphic, but it's only speaking symbolically. This isn't to be taken literally. The rabbis, though, from 1,000 years earlier than that, or from 800 or 500 years earlier than that, the rabbis of the Talmudic era, the rabbis who produced the interpretations known as Midrash, they actually, I think, don't have any trouble with that anthropomorphism. They're just as, I think that they think that God does have a body, and that body can sometimes be more or less accurately described in terms that sound similar to a human body. Not identical, but similar.
Yeah.
At the same time, when we put them all together, we realize they're massively different from a human being, because we humans have only one body. We have only one self. We can't fragment while remaining unified. If you take us apart, we're just dead. We can't overlap with somebody else. But God is really radically different and radically mysterious, precisely for the fluidity texts, precisely because God has more than one body, more than one manifestation. God can be a unity even when God is a plurality. That's why these, I think, are still monotheistic texts. There's still only one deity, but this deity has multiple manifestations. So in a funny way, I think that the fluidity texts, although initially they seem a little more polytheistic, and they do share something for real with actual polytheistic texts from ancient Canaan, Assyria, and Babylonia, I think that in their own sophisticated way, they're also very monotheistic, because one of the main ideas of monotheism is that God is fundamentally transcendent, not part of the world, fundamentally different from humanity. And in these texts, God is very mysteriously different from humanity in a way that we can't quite get our heads around, precisely because God retains a unity, even as God has more than one manifestation. And even, I think, more than one physical manifestation, more than one body. The New Testament's idea, for example, in the first chapter of John, of, well, actually the opening chapters of John altogether, of God coming down and overlapping with Jesus, or God being at once the Logos who is with God and thus separate from God, but is also God. That sounds like very strange language, but when you're familiar with the fluidity model from the ancient Near East, which some texts of the Hebrew Bible contain, I think that we realize that those sort of models you're getting in the New Testament are actually not new models in Judaism. This is a first century type of Judaism that is hearkening back to the fluidity model that ancient Israel had inherited from the ancient Near East. The idea of the Trinity, which I think most New Testament scholars would say is not yet quite fully present in the New Testament, but gets articulated in post-New Testament literature. The idea of the Trinity too is I think it's really a new way of repackaging the ancient Israelite fluidity model.
Right.
I think that that's interesting. And when I was writing the book, this was really quite surprising to me, because the Trinity is a kind of fluidity model. It's the idea that one deity can have more than one manifestation, more than one aspect, more than one person. And if that's the case, then the Trinity is just a new way of utilizing a much more ancient theological model that was native to ancient Israel.
Are you of the agreement that Isaiah knew more about God, as far as a human being can know, than Moses?
That's an interesting question. First, before getting to Isaiah and Moses, yes, I do agree that over time, that we can gain from previous generations new insights into God. We can stand on the shoulders of previous generations. We can combine previous generations' insights to go somewhere where those previous generations hadn't gone. I think that it's often the case that we might even be able, in our own new setting, to understand more fully what somebody said centuries or even millennia ago. I think that sometimes happens, that somebody says something and the full import and even meaning of what the first person said isn't understood until centuries later. So in that regard, I think that in many respects, revelation in some sense continues, or maybe we hear nuances in an older revelation that older generations didn't hear. So even if it was still just a revelation that occurred in the past, at some level that revelation continues to speak and even speaks in new ways as we go into the future. I think that this is an idea that one finds in a certain kind of Jewish theology. I deal a lot more with that theology in my book on Revelation at Sinai. As for Isaiah and Moses, I wouldn't want to go too much into specifics. It certainly is a bedrock idea of Judaism that Moses was the greatest of the prophets. And so I think that I'd be hesitant about making that statement that Isaiah knew more than Moses, but I think I would be comfortable saying that Isaiah expresses aspects of God and articulates aspects of God more explicitly that in Moses' case are not articulated as explicitly. I think I would put it that way.
No, that's an interesting answer. Thank you. And just touching upon what you said before, that when John says, for instance, uses in his prologue, in the beginning was the word was with God, that whole concept, he didn't pluck that out of thin air, right? So
A, he didn't plug it out of thin air, and B, he's not only getting it indirectly from Plato. He's not just getting it from Greek culture. Certainly Hellenistic culture is contributing to the way he's formulating this. The wording he uses probably is indebted indirectly to Plato, but that's a matter of the wording. The conception of a deity who is multiple and yet still fundamentally one, that's an idea that John is getting from his Jewish heritage and from the heritage of Hebrew scripture.